I'm gonna eat too. This is a new thing. I'm gonna eat.
Oh. Okay, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me okay. We do enjoy a visual audience if that's possible. If you have the capacity and willingness to leave your webcam on, please do that. And so our presenters, okay. Are you hearing me, Stuart?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, okay. Apologies. I was getting some feedback that I wasn't being heard, but now I'm being heard. Good. So we would love you to leave your webcam on here for the QPW Queer Politics webinar, because it's nice for our presenters to see some faces. If you're not able to do that, then that's just fine as well. So welcome you once again to those of you who didn't hear. My name is Andy Reynolds. I'm at Princeton University. And this is now our 36th version of the Queer Politics webinar, which is an attempt to connect us all virtually around the world in the study of queer LGBTQ plus politics and social sciences and geography and the law and sociology and every lens that we can think of to try and understand the way in which queer people navigate the social and political world that we live in today. We're going to try and set up one more webinar for this year, for this term, which will be in December, which I'll announce soon. And then we'll work on the spring scheduling. And it's possible that we will move to a hybrid in the spring where we have both in-person seminars that are live streamed to the world. So we can have people in person here at Princeton. And you can also listen and ask questions as well, wherever you may be in the world, starting in January. So we are very excited today to welcome two of our leading scholars of LGBTQ politics based in Europe. And we have, as you've seen, Stuart Turnbull-Dugarte, who is at the University of Southampton. And Stuart's presentation today will be titled "The Apple Comes Out and Votes Independently from the Tree, Parental Partisanship, Self-Reported Sexuality, and Voting Behavior." And then we will have Michael Smrek, who is from Uppsala University in Sweden, where the grass is greener, persistent sexuality gaps in voter turnout in Sweden. Many of you will know that Stuart is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Southampton, who works in comparative politics and political sociology and looks a lot at voting behavior and political party competition. Michael is a researcher at the Department of Government at Uppsala University, as I said, works on issues around inclusion and also works on issues of representation, political parties, and legislative behavior, and to some extent on candidate selection and gender politics as well. So, as you'll know, if you've been to these webinars before, we take two presentations and then we will have time for questions. If you have a question for either Stuart or Michael, then please send me a note in the chat box just saying you would like to be on the question list. You do not need to tell me what the question is. Just send a little note to me saying I want to be on the question list at any point, and then I can line up the questions after Stuart and Michael have presented. We will go as long as we need to go until we run out of questions or until 1 o'clock when we have to close the webinar. So without further ado, thank you all for being here. And let me call on Stuart to start. And if you have slides, you can share those now and we'll take our two presentations. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So can someone just give me a thumbs up just to confirm that they're seeing the slides on the screen? Okay, perfect. So thanks very much for inviting me to the seminar. I feel like I have been a bit of a veteran attendee to the seminar, so I'm very happy to have my maiden voyage and present to you today. So I'm basically going to be making a presentation on voting behavior of LGBT individuals in the UK, which is part of my long-going agenda on trying to queer empirical political science in behavior in the European context. So since I was trained in an economics department, I'll begin my presentation by essentially summarizing what I'm going to say over the next couple of minutes, because in econ, you normally never get to the end of your presentation. So the research question I essentially want to ask is, does sexuality play a role when it comes to the intergenerational transmission of political preferences or ultimately electoral choices? One of the main theories that we have in political behavior is that individuals tend to replicate or inherit the preference of their parents. But given that queer individuals have different kinship relationships with their families, is this some sort of mediator in that relationship? How do I go about answering that question? Oh, here we go. Oh, no. I'm trying to hide the Zoom bar at the top of my screen, which is hiding the left and right button. Let me just have a look. How can I go about this? No. Oh, here we go. Paper summary. No, still no. Oh, there we go. I've moved it to the bottom. Here we go. So how do I go about answering this question? Well, essentially, I rely on data from the British election study, which is gold standard national representative election study in the UK, which has very recently started to include a direct measure of sexual orientation in their survey. So we can observe non-heterosexual individuals in their survey, which we weren't able to do in the past. And I basically want to ask, what is the relationship between parental partisanship, so the partisanships of an individual's parents, both their mother and their father, on LGBT identification, so the willingness of individuals to out themselves to survey interviewers during the survey process, and ultimately on their voting behavior. Some spoilers about what the results are going to show in the presentation later on. Well, essentially, the sexuality gap in political electoral preferences and outcomes and voting is unconditioned by parental partisanship. So regardless of whether you came from a household which had strong conservative ties or very strong Labour ties, or somewhere in between, like the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, which are other parties in the UK party system, basically plays no role on determining whether there's a gap between LGBT individuals and their heterosexual peers. Also importantly is that there's no role between the partisan makeup of your household, so whether your parents were conservatives or liberals, on your propensity to identify as LGBT. And this is quite significant because some of the theories that explain the divergence in LGBT and heterosexual voting behavior is that, you know, to give you an American context, democratic households essentially produce more LGBT or T+ identifying individuals. Of course, it's not to say that they create homosexuality or bisexuality or different gender identities in their individuals, but they do create an environment that influences people's willingness to adopt one of these identities. I find, however, in the UK that this is not the case. Ultimately, how does then LGBT relationships identification, relate to intergenerational transmission of preferences? Well, if you're from a conservative household, you're far more likely to break away from those ties. Whereas if you're from a liberal household, I say liberal here, basically indicating supporting of the Labour Party, you're far more likely to converge with your parents. So sexuality, in sum, the main finding is does play a moderating role in intergenerational transmission. So let me just set the scene for what the literature currently looks like when it comes to the sexuality gap in voting in the UK. So this is a figure that if any of you follow me on Twitter, you've probably seen in the past. It's stuck on my homepage for quite a while, but I think it's an effective way of summing up what we already know about LGBT voting behavior in the UK. And essentially, when we compare different sexual and minority identifiers, whether they be lesbian, gay, or bisexual, they are significantly less likely to support the currently governing right-wing Conservative Party. So when we look at the aggregate, so basically all sexual minority individuals, lesbian, gay, or bi versus their heterosexual peers, there's a gap. But even as we show on this graph, when we break down the community into their different intersections, bi versus gay or lesbian, for example, or women versus men, the gap is consistent. One thing I signal here is that when we compare taking the baseline, a white heterosexual man with a white homosexual man, or a white heterosexual woman with a white heterosexual man, we see that the gender gap, so the gender defects, which is, has a long pedigree in political silence, there are hundreds and hundreds of papers written about the gender gap in voting behavior, is 2 percentage points, which is, when you compare the substantive magnitude of the sexuality effect, is actually only 1/5 of the comparable gap, we would say, based on sexuality. So I kind of also use this graph as a rallying cry to indicate the importance of the sexuality variable, which, whilst individuals in this crowd might be sympathetic to that, there are other peers in political science that might not adopt that same worldview. But comparing these magnitudes is important because it kind of symbolizes the importance of those factors. So this is just taking a cross section at a specific time, substantive sexuality gap in the direction that we would expect. In the second graph, what I signal is that this gap in preferences between LGB individuals and their heterosexual peers is pretty consistent over time. So what we're looking at here is panel data from the British election study. And on the left-hand side, we have support for what we consider the three main parties in the UK, Labour, Conservative, and Lib Dems over time. And on the right, we have the same distribution, but for LGB voters. Whilst amongst heterosexuals, we can basically say it's a pretty close horse race between Labour and the Conservatives. In most elections, it's very close to a coin toss, at least in the popular vote. There's variation because of, first past the post in the constituencies, but in terms of the popular vote, it's very close to a coin toss. But when you look at the LGB voters, it's clear that over a long period of time, substantially and significantly larger support for Labour amongst sexual minority voters, in this case, lesbian, gays, and bisexuals. So that's where we are. That's what we already know in the literature, among some things I've published among some other peers as well. But what I'm interested in is trying to assess what are the mechanisms behind this gap. So is there a relationship between the type of household that you come from in establishing these, as we observe in this graph, pretty stable and substantial gaps over time? So they're essentially, to give a brief worldview, 4 theoretical propositions that explain the sexuality gap in electoral behavior, and I'll go through these very briefly. So the first is the rational choice model, which essentially assumes that sexual minority voters are concerned about their welfare, so will send their ballots and cast their votes for political parties that are more likely to defend policy positions that are going to defend their interests. So what you see in this graph is essentially the y-axis is the saliency of LGBT rights issues. Higher values mean it's more important for the party. And on the x-axis is opposition to LGBT rights. So lower values mean more liberal, higher values mean more conservative. Kind of no surprises here. Greens, Social Democrats, Liberals, far left parties are more pro-LGBT plus and more vocally so. So taking as valid the rational choice model of voters are going to go for parties that defend their interests. Hence, more LGBT individuals vote for Labour or the Lib Dems because those are the parties that seek to defend their welfare. Pretty straightforward spatial choice model of voter preferences. A second model that explains the sexuality gap is convergence. So this is essentially argues that LGBT individuals go through a process when they begin to become conscious of their other status or experience discrimination from the state or from society. And that basically engenders some sort of shared underdog status with other minority groups, whether that be based on race or class or ethnicity or social status, which leads to them advocating positions that are favorable to benefiting minority positions. For example, increased social welfare, expanding safety net for individuals, reforming policy positions that are going to help establish racial equality, etc. So it's essentially, in sum, this theory mechanism is becoming an underdog, but whether that be through some sort of process of self-realization or because of direct processes of discrimination that you've experienced in your life, is going to shape your political preferences. A third mechanism is socialization or culturalization. So there is a lot of literature that establishes that LGBT plus culture is significantly more diverse and inclusive than heterosexual culture. Now, I want to be very conscious here and kind of put the disclaimer up that I'm not saying that LGBT plus culture is monolithic in its inclusivity and in diversity. There is, of course, discrimination in this block, but compared to their heterosexual peers, these individuals are far more likely to have partners of a different sex, of a different race, from a different social background, different educational makeup, which means that they're exposed within their own social networks to far more diverse social settings, which drives a process of acculturation, which is likely to lead them to more parties that advocate for these policies. The final mechanism, and one that's advocated most explicitly by Patrick Egan at New York University, is partisan sorting. So essentially, Patrick Egan's argument is that it's not the case that LGBT plus status leads to some sort of transformation in political preferences or party vote choice, but rather individuals who come from liberal households are far more likely to identify as LGBT plus in social surveys, which means that when we model their behavior on certain outcomes, there's a spurious relationship, because actually those who we're identifying as out in surveys, their outness is predetermined by the type of household they came from in the past. So Patrick Egan's paper, which is fantastic, it's in the British Journal of Political Science, he doesn't model directly parental partisanship, but uses a number of proxies such as the level of education of the mother, the ethnicity of the family. And essentially he shows that when you model on these parental characteristics, the sexuality gap essentially disappears. And his argument is then because social sorting is taking place. It's not the case, of course, that Republicans or Republican households don't produce individuals who are homosexual or bisexual or trans, is that these individuals are not openly identifying in surveys, which means that there's a spurious relationship being established between parental characteristics and LGBT plus identification. This is the mechanism that I want to focus on in establishing the sexuality gap in the UK. So essentially, I'm going to run through this quite quickly here. One of the main theories we have in political science is intergenerational transmission of political preferences. Lots of different quotes here, essentially saying the same thing, that when it comes to socializing individuals into politics, the family is a core component. Now, I propose a number of arguments that this is likely to be different in the case of sexual minority individuals. So what I'm showing you in this theoretical model is basically the steps of intergenerational transmission of characteristics. So on the bottom left here, hopefully you can see my cursor, is family group socialization. And this is the most direct mechanism. In this case, we have parents talking to their children about politics, about policy preferences, and how they should, or people like them, vote, or the beliefs that they should have. The structural equivalence argument is essentially arguing that intergenerational transmission is spurious, in that there doesn't need to be direct action taken by the parents to socialize their children, but just that because children are likely to come from the same social class background as their parents, share the same faith as their parents, or share the same ethnicity or live in the same locality as their parents, that this structural equivalence is also going to shape their partisan preferences. So within the heteronormative literature, these two mechanisms are what explains intergenerational transmission. Structural equivalence, basically sharing the same demographics as your parents, as well as family group socialization, so these active processes. I argue that there's a mechanism that disrupts this process, and that's the independently acquired sexual identity or gender-based identities. Now, what makes them these distinct from other characteristics is that they are independent of all other determinants. One assumption I'm basically making here is that the born this way argument is essentially correct, and that homosexuality, bisexuality, or being born with a gender identity that you do not identify with is independent of other covariates that determine your political preferences. And that leads you to engage in behavior that might disrupt the intergenerational transmission of preferences. Why do we think this could be the case? Well, on the one hand, there's a lot of literature that demonstrates that kinship for sexual minority individuals is very much distinct from that from their heteronormative peers. Individuals who are queer in their adult lives place far more emphasis on friendship networks and other forms of kinship rather than relationships with their family or with their parents. Historically, this has been because in many cases, individuals were marginalized from their core family networks, so were kind of coerced into these relationships, but there are also more self-selecting processes, and the individuals feel more comfortable engaging in kinship activities with individuals, quote unquote, like them. Importantly, these kind of kinship relationships are likely to develop later on in life, once an individual has left the home. But there are also important relationships that disrupt the intergenerational transmission that take place when individuals are already in the home. Now, we know from political sociology literature that most political preferences are developed during an individual's formative years, essentially when they are teenagers. We also know, however, from literature on queer theory and studies of queer psychology, that this sensitization phase, when individuals are becoming aware of their otherness, that they are likely to have sexual preferences that deviate from the heteronormative norm, is also taking place at the same time. And what happens is individuals are likely to seek out information that is independent of the household and also independent of their locality. So for example, here I'm showing a GIF that's from the Hulu series Love, Victor, that actually serves as an important representation of the mechanism that I'm theorizing here. So essentially in the series, to give you a brief overview, there's a Latin American kid called Victor Salazar. He's brought up by socially conservative parents, has no other queer individuals in his local environment, so ends up interacting with another queer individual online to find out information about how to know that you're gay, how to go about gay practices, etc. And this is a really simple but also effective demonstration of the mechanism that I'm theorizing here. And individuals within a household that has acquired some sort of ascriptic trait that is independent of his family and independent of his local community, and then engages in self-selected information processes that are likely to have a socializing effect on his political preferences. Now, whilst here I'm showing a flippant example from Love, Victor, there is a literature on this, for example, in queer psychology, that shows that queer individuals, even in the pre-internet age, were engaged in information-seeking activities in order to help them come to terms with their sexuality, but also ultimately to socialize, in some cases, engage with sexual activity with other queer members or members of the queer community, which it was going to play a socializing effect on their political preferences. So whilst I take the view that socialization is a core important role in establishing political preferences, I argue that even individuals within conservative households who have or inherited LGBT identity are going to engage in socialization processes that are going to interrupt the intergenerational transmission of preferences. So essentially two hypotheses here. On the one hand, we could take as valid Egan's argument that sexual identification is going to be dependent on parental partisanship. In this case, we should see that Labour households produce more LGBT identifiers than non-Labour households. Again, the emphasis here is on identification. It's not the case that they produce more homosexuals or bisexuals or whatever. It's on identification. Assuming, however, that that's not the case and that sexual identities are adopted independently of the household, this then leads on to two implications. On the one hand, the sexual identity gap should be consistent across all parental household types because the parental households are not determining identification. There's no reason to explain why it should diminish the gap. And secondly, it will lead to divergence based on the parentalship, the partisanship of the household. Conservative households will see divergence with LGBT youth, whereas liberal or Labour households will likely see convergence because they are going to adopt beliefs that are consistent with those of their parents. Very briefly, because I want to get to the results, the research design essentially relies on data from the British election study, around 4,000 individuals, and we have about 12% of the sample identifies as non-heterosexual, lesbian, gay, or bisexual. Unfortunately, the British election study does still not include a mechanism for identifying trans individuals, but I'm very happy to say that after quite a long discussion with organisers of the Scottish election study, they have now included a trans identifying survey instrument in their survey. So when the Scottish election study data comes out, I and everyone here on this call will be able to look at trans-based divergence in preferences. So thank you, shout out to the Scottish election study team who did this. So basically what I do is I model the role of parental partisanship first on LGBT identification. So it's a survey instrument that asks individuals their orientation, and also on vote choice. It's essentially retrospective vote choice. Two other outcome variables that I look at are ideological preferences. And I do this based on the economic dimension and the liberal authoritarian dimension. And these are basically how these variables are composed from the British election study. I specifically do not model the effect of sexuality on how much do you identify with the left-right dimension, because this is likely going to cause an endogenous relationship. LGBT individuals are more likely to identify on the left, so when I prime them using the terms left and right, it might influence their responses here. So there should be less endogeneity in this case, where we're asking concrete policy issues rather than abstract terms such as left and right. Basically, model specification, regular bread and butter OLS regressions. I use only covariates that we can be confident are not influenced by sexuality, for example, income and education, although later controlling for these doesn't influence the coefficients. But we shouldn't, since sexuality is likely to have detrimental effects on educational performance or income, as a number of studies have shown. Let's get into the meat of what the results actually show. First question is, does parental partisanship influence your propensity to tell an interviewer that you are LGBT? No. Regardless of whether you come from a completely non-labor household, so that's the plot on the far left, or a consolidated labor household, i.e. both of your parents are labor voters, there is no significant difference in your propensity to identify as LGBT in the survey. In the case of this penultimate spike here, which is if you have a labor labor voting mother only, but your father votes for something else, the point estimate is larger, but there's not a lot of observations here, so the gap is insignificant. Essentially, parental partisanship, whether your parents belong to labor or not, has no effect on your outness in the survey. You might be aware that, okay, in the UK, there are more parties than just Labour and Conservative. So when I do a kind of aggregate left party, where I include Labour and Liberal Democrats and the Greens together, the results essentially replicate here. The point estimates are obviously slightly different, but there's no significant gaps between any left party and essentially the Conservatives and other right-wing groups. So to answer research question 1, no, there is no influence on parental partisanship on outness in social surveys, at least in the UK. What about ideological preferences? So basically, let's look at the first half of the graph first, where we look at economic preferences, size of the state, taxes, etc. And on the first column here, which hopefully my cursor is moving over, this is individuals who have no parental incentives to identify on the left. So neither of the parents are voting Labour or other left-wing parties, and we see this a sizable sexuality gap in this case. The darker color here, for those who are color impaired, is the darker one where the cursor's over at the moment, but for those who can see, it's pink, significant gap. Even when we compare individuals who have high incentives to be left, i.e. either from a consolidated Labour household, the gap still exists. Obviously, both types of individuals, heterosexual and LGBs, are more liberal because they come from consolidated Labour homes, but the gap still persists. LGBT individuals are still more liberal than individuals who come from the same type of household. On the right, we're looking at social cultural dimensions, stiffer penalties, attitudes towards immigration, attitudes towards the EU, etc. Again, in the first column here, those individuals where there are very little incentives to be liberal, at least according to your parental partisanship, neither of your parents were liberal voters, there's a substantive sexuality gap. So we cannot say that the sexuality gap in preferences is established because of spurious relationship caused by your parents' relationship. Again, when we look at those individuals where there's a consolidated incentive to be liberal, again, the sexuality gap persists. So parental partisanship is not explaining away the sexuality gap in this case. These are preferences, but what we really want to see, of course, is vote choice. And this is the same relationship, again, demonstrated here. Far left, in this kind of purple color, we have heterosexual individuals who come from non-Labour households, so completely non-Labour. The kind of pink color here is LGBT individuals who come from non-Labour household. Substantive sexuality gap here, it's actually about 20 percentage points, and it's 100% increase relative to the same heterosexual groups. So we have substantive differentiation from what parents' preferences are here. Parents who we can assume are voting for Conservatives or UKIP, they're non-Labour, non-left parties, right? Their heterosexuals have a 1 in 5 chance of voting Labour. But for the LGBT individuals, it's more than a 50% chance. So they're already crushing that threshold. Again, even where we look at the tough case scenario in those households where incentives are in place for individuals to be Labour voters, the gap is still present. There's still something more about sexuality that's driving increased support for left-wing parties. We cannot explain away the relationship based on parental or pre-treatment, pre-sexuality characteristics. One alternative approach that we can model, however, is a matching approach, which in basic term means we ensure that we compare like for like individuals. So what I do here is in the top part where it says treated units, these are essentially the LGB respondents that I find from the survey. And I matched these individuals to other respondents in the survey who have the same parental household characteristics, the same ethnicity, the same age, and the same religion, and also come from the same constituency. The benefit of this is that I am essentially making sure that I compare LGB individuals with heterosexual individuals that are as similar as possible on the covariates that we have. The drawback from this approach is that we have these unmatched units. Essentially, it means whilst we aim for symmetry to have like for like comparison, that comes with losing some observations. What does this look like empirically in terms of the results? Essentially, it confirms the expectation that we have. So the circle here is the person comparing the chance of voting for Labour between LGBTs and heterosexuals, about 20 percentage points. The diamond here in the dark purple is what we're interested in, which is the matching coefficient. So when we match individuals, LGBT individuals, with heterosexuals of the same age, same ethnicity, same religion, same constituency, and the same partisan makeup of their parents, there is still a sizable 14 percentage point gap in their propensity to vote for Labour. So we cannot explain away the sexuality gap based on pre-treatment parental characteristics. What are some of the take-home messages from the study so far? Well, empirically, there's strong evidence that LGBT individuals are significantly more liberal than heterosexual peers on multiple dimensions and also in their voting behavior. LGBT individuals from a non-Labour background, so where there's incentives to be conservative based on structural equivalence and also family socialization, LGBs are more likely to break away from those conservative households and move to Labour. In the case of heterosexuals, however, that's not the case, but LGBs from a consolidated Labour household are more likely to vote in line with their parents. Kind of a methodological takeaway from these findings is that one critique of studies which rely on LGBT identification as an explanatory variable is that there are other determinants of whether or not you adopt a sexuality, but we can be confident that these pre-treatment co-founders are not political, at least in the UK. Theoretical, well, I basically take odds with the argument of the sorting or socialization argument that Ekin presents, whilst I don't take odds with the empirics of his paper. They're not replicated here in the UK. It's not even the case that controlling for parental partisan dilutes the effect. The point estimate is essentially symmetrical. So we can be pretty confident that the parental sorting or socialization of individuals is not having a detrimental effect on the effect of sexuality. Limitations of what I presented so far that I can identify. Well, one is scope conditions. So it might be the case that the spurious parental relationship is limited to the US based on some sort of US exceptionalism or partisan sorting there. On the other hand, it might be based on temporal variation. Perhaps if the study could have been carried out 20 years ago, and if there was data on this, perhaps we would see a different relationship. And the independence of identification as LGB might be a function of the fact that we have a more socially tolerant society in the UK at the moment. One counter argument I would have to that limitation is that when I look at the effects of parental partisanship across different cohorts, because I have quite a large sample, there's essentially no conditional effect of age. So when I compare individuals who were socialized during the Thatcher years, for example, or even before then, it's not the case that partisan identification plays a role during that period either. Another limitation is at the moment, as I kind of acknowledged earlier on, is trans individuals are not included in the study. That's regrettable, but luckily, given the the willingness of the Scottish Election Study to include a measure in their latest survey, I can replicate this analysis essentially on a different country to make sure that trans individuals are included. And that's something that I look forward to doing. My expectation is that the effect will be the same, if not bigger, in the case of trans individuals, given that the mechanisms that I propose, i.e. seeking out information relative to your newly acquired identity, are likely to be even more important for trans individuals. And that's all. Thank you very much. Hopefully I've not ran over too much time.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Stuart. That was a wonderful presentation and really interesting for a lot of us who are deeply invested in this field. So let me call, well, actually first, let me say, please, if you would like to ask a question based on Stuart's presentation, send me a message in the chat box and I'll put you on the list. But let me now call on Mikael to give us his presentation, focusing more on Svenska.
Mikael, I can't hear you, sorry.
Do you hear me now?
Yep, that's good. Now we hear you. Go ahead.
I'm really sorry. It must be my microphone that is out of order. All right, welcome everyone to this presentation, which is entitled Where the Grass is Greener, Persistent Sexuality Gap in Voter Turnout in Sweden. My name is Michael Smrek and I'm a PhD in political science at the Department of Government at Uppsala University. For those of you who are wondering who this human actually is, you are right. I'm new to this subfield of sexuality politics. I have a PhD in political science from 2019, and my original area of expertise is political recruitment, gender and politics, incumbent renomination, political parties, and legislative behavior. So, I mean, none of my current publications touch upon issues of sexuality politics, but the forthcoming might. And this presentation will give you a teaser of what it is that I'm currently working on, mostly in my spare time, because my main research is still within the field of political recruitment in gender and politics. All right, to give you some background, there's plenty of evidence suggesting that individuals who identify with other than heterosexual group identity share similar political attitudes, party preferences, and are more likely than comparable heterosexual to participate in political processes of various kinds, like signing petitions, taking part in a protest, or as new as research by none other than Stuart, who has had the presentation before me, greater likelihood to turn out at the ballot box or greater likelihood to participate in electoral races. In one of Stuart's publications, together with the co-author, they explain it with a vote as if your rights depended on a mechanism. And what this mechanism basically says is that LGB voters are either in the process of fighting for more civic rights or in the process of defending the already acquired civic rights that are constantly threatened. So the idea that LGB group identity, as the presentation before me has already revealed, that the LGB group identity is a politically salient identity is not a new one. But we also know the LGB group identity is an odd bird as far as minority group identities are concerned. So we know that most minority group identities like class, ethnicity, or religion are product of early life socialization. And while same-sex attraction is most likely genetically conditioned, which means that we have it from birth, embracing LGB group identity as a social identity requires that an individual in question rejects the heterosexual socialization that he or she or they have received within family and other early life socializing agents. And now scholars disagree what it is that makes this identity that we acquire later in life so politically salient that it actually minimizes the effect of other politically salient group identities like class, religion, again. And I mean, I'm not going to repeat the different theories that Stuart has already gone through. I mean, there's views that group consciousness is created through adult re-socialization and within group acculturation. So I mean, non-straight individuals who embrace non-straight group identity seek themselves into like-minded groups where they sort of are gradually exposed to the values of these groups. It might also be a selection mechanism, or if we believe in Stuart's presentation, it's not selection mechanism, but that is sort of also a theoretical view out there that people who are more likely to have liberal values are also more likely to embrace a non-straight group identity, which is sort of, which is why we see the cohesion in the political values, but also greater likelihood to take part in political processes. We also have a linked faith theory, which is sort of a modification of group consciousness theory. And that is sort of a theory that says that common history of discrimination and alienation has an important effect on political participation that transcends within group diversity. So I mean, we have people of different classes, different races, different genders identifying with LGBT group identity. All these other group identities should have an effect on our political participation, but this common history of discrimination and profound alienation produces similar patterns of political behavior. Now, the problem is that the existing empirical evidence is mostly derived from majoritarian or plurality electoral systems. Now, I'm going to say something that sort of people coming from majoritarian and plurality systems don't really like, but these are fairly unique electoral settings with two major parties that sort of decrease the coordination cost for minorities because it's fairly easy to identify who is the lesser of the two evils. It also sort of increases the impact of organized minority vote on the outcome of an election, which is sort of a winner takes it all scenario. So sort of it has this profound effect where we can really change the direction of this government. And a lot of existing empirical evidence also comes from a time period when the battle for equal rights was intensifying. Another limitation of existing evidence is that it's based on survey data. Survey data that was not originally collected to study LGBs or their political behavior. This is why we often find very limited samples. We also have the problem of social desirability bias, the willingness to identify as an LGBT person. And we also have the problem of data pooling across contexts. So many of the existing papers pool data across both a long time period, but also across different political systems. All right, and that brings me to the gap. It is very difficult to establish whether the observed political participation patterns, this greater likelihood of LGBT individuals to take part in political processes like elections, are isolated incidents driven by either incomplete data or the temporality of the data, or whether they are only applicable to the unique majoritarian settings. And this makes it difficult to establish how salient. So we do know, I mean, there's consistent evidence showing that the non-straight group identity is salient, but we do not still know how salient it really is. So in my study, I'm looking at sexuality gap in voter turnout in the multi-party settings of Sweden, where public acceptance for same-sex rights is extremely high. So Sweden is consistently #1 in Eurobarometer in terms of public acceptance for same-sex rights, same-sex marriage. It's in very high numbers, approaching, I think, 97% of the population in favor of same-sex rights. Sweden is also a country where non-heterosexuals enjoy a broad array of civic rights. So the same-sex partnership bill came into force in 1995 and was in place until 2009, when a gender-neutral marriage legislation was passed by the Swedish parliament. Adoptions, at least on paper, are legal in Sweden since 2004. And as I said, same-sex marriage in the form of gender-neutral marriage bill is available since 2009. And another thing about Sweden, which is really important, is that all political parties that are currently represented in the Swedish parliament are explicitly in favor of same-sex rights. And this includes the populist radical right Sweden Democrats that sort of oscillate between a lukewarm and cold stance towards same-sex rights, but they are very seldom explicitly against same-sex rights. They do have their periods when they're sort of more cold, but it's not that they are as hostile as their counterparts in other European countries. So how am I gonna look at this? Well, I use the Maiden famous Swedish register data, which includes data on the entire population of Sweden from 1913 onwards. And I have access to data on civic status, employment, education, family relations, who are your parents, who are your children, place of residence, moving across residences. And I also have data on actual individual level turnout data for elections. How do I identify non-heterosexual individuals? Well, this is a bit harder. Up to 2009, I have data on those who have used the same-sex partnership bill and registered their partnership. Approximately 5,000 individuals up to 2009 have made use of this. Those I can very easily identify because there was a unique identifier in the register data for it. From 2009, the situation is more problematic because what the Swedish parliament passed, which is of course good, not good for finding non-straight individuals, but what is good is that the Swedish parliament passed a gender-neutral marriage bill, which means that there is no unique code in register data for same-sex marriage, there is only code for marriage. But thanks to a family identifier, I can actually identify cohabitating married same-sex individuals fairly easily in the register data. So through some detective work, I can actually identify all the married same-sex individuals who share the same household. Which elections can I look at? Well, I can look at the 2009 and 2019 EU elections and 2010 and 2018 parliamentary elections. So 4 elections in total. These elections are very interesting. First of all, in 2009, the gender-neutral marriage bill was passed just months before the 2009 EU elections. So this is sort of the time when the fight for marriage equality was at its intensive. And a year later, we have a general election in Sweden where the threat of Sweden Democrats, the populist radical right party, was imminent, and they also made it to the parliament. The other 2 elections, the 2018 parliamentary elections and 2019 parliamentary elections, are also interesting because during this time, during these 10 years, all the remaining political parties dropped their opposition to LGBTQI+ rights. So I mean, the parliament only has champions, so to speak, of LGBTQI+ rights during this time. So what about then proportional settings and LGB mobilization? There are some arguments that speak in favor that we should see voter mobilization even in LGB settings. There are some arguments against. The arguments for are that we have more parties in PR settings, which means that there is a higher likelihood that there will be a champion for LGB rights. And if there is one champion, then the cost of coordination, just like majoritarian settings, decreases. And the benefits of mobilization increase. What we also have, thanks to more parties, is more candidates. And if we believe in the role model theory, perhaps having more LGB candidates has an effect on political participation of LGB individuals. It's also easier for radical parties to come in PR settings because of the thresholds and because of how the electoral system is organized, which also increases the likelihood of counter mobilization. Another benefiting sort of attribute is that geographically dispersed minorities have greater influence on the outcome of the election than if we have single member districts and minorities are sort of geographically dispersed, because then their vote is essentially canceled out. In PR settings, they can pool their vote across the country. Sort of a plus minus thing is coalition governments, which are common in PR settings, which means that compromises are necessary, which also might mean that governments need to drop LGBT rights if there is sort of a party that is against it. Now, the negative arguments are the generally higher turnout rates. The higher the turnout rates, the smaller the impact of organized minority vote on the outcome of the elections. There can be more than one minority champions, as is the case in Sweden, which increases incredibly the coordination costs for minority. Which party are we going to vote for? And if LGBT issues are no longer politically salient, that also, and this would be sort of a general argument, it also decreases the incentives for participating. All right, so what are my expectations? We are going to see spike in LGBT mobilization around the 2009 and 2010 elections. It will be higher in the second tier EU elections because the turnout is generally lower, and that sort of makes the benefits of organized turnout greater. And we will see weaker mobilization among LGBT voters in 2018 and 2019 elections. Why do I expect it? Well, there's plenty of research on, for instance, Black vote in the US that shows a decline in Black voters turnout after the civil rights movement and a new spike around the time Obama became a candidate. So in Sweden, during this 10-year period after same-sex marriage, we sort of have all the parties coming on board. So we have all these champions in the Swedish parliament, and the sort of the civic rights situation in Sweden is fairly good. So we shouldn't see that much of a mobilization, and LGBT individuals should perhaps be driven by their other group identities when it comes to as drivers of their political participation. Okay, what is my method? I'm using matching. Since I have access to population data, that's the perfect method because then I can really find twins to my LGBT individuals. The matching variables are age, number of children, size of the family, currently married, currently separated, currently without, and turnout in the municipality. I do not match on education and or place of residence, which are also determinants of turnout. And there's sort of discussion in the matching literature that one should not match on covariates that also explain the outcome of interest. So this is why these are the matching variables. Just to walk you through the sample a little bit, for the 2009 and 10 batch of elections, the adult population was 7,085,000. And out of those, we have 6,645 LGBs. In the 2018 sample, the population has grown by approximately 1 million, and we have approximately 15,707 LGBs. The results, before I give you the tables, show that there is persistent positive gap in voter turnout and even candidacy patterns among identified non-straight individuals, both in 2009 and 10 elections, but also in 2018 and 19 elections. And no evidence that the gap is abating. So despite these least likely settings, a lot of champions, LGBT issues are really not on the political agenda to the same extent that they have been a decade ago. There is no real evidence that the gap is abating. So this is sort of the result for the first batch of elections. You see that, I mean, the overall turnout in 2009 was 43%. You see that within the match population, it's 51%, and within the LGBT population is 67% in the European elections. When it comes to the general election, the overall turnout was 85%. It's 87% in the matched population and 92% in the LGBT population. So a 16 percentage point significant difference for the EU elections and 5 percentage point significant difference for the general election. Now look at the 2018 and 2019, it's similar patterns. While we had 5% in the general election in 2010, we have 6 percentage points in 2018. And while we had 16 percentage points for the EU elections in 2009, we have 15 percentage points for EU elections in 2019. 19. And sort of these associations are significant, even if we do traditional fixed effects regressions with fixed effects for age, for municipality, and even for education, and include the appropriate sort of control, which is mixed sex, married, and family individuals. All right, and I'm happy to share this. I know that this is a lot of numbers, but what they show is that there is a positive sexuality gap in voter turnout, and this gap is not abating at all. So what are the mechanisms? Might it be candidacy? And you might have seen, while this presentation focuses on turnout, I also have data on candidacy, and there's positive gap in candidacy in all 4 elections when it comes to LGBT individuals. So I mean, political parties do recruit within this particular group to a large extent. So that could be a potential mechanism. Could it be the steady growth of the Sweden Democrats? As I said, these are not that LGBTQI unfriendly as their cousins in other countries. And the associations persist even when municipality fixed effects are included. There we sort of compare people within the same municipality. So perhaps it shouldn't be driven by the sort of mobilization for or against Sweden Democrats. It might, of course, be selection. Those who get married are more likely to be politically interested. So this is sort of the most likely group. I mean, these are people who actually entered into a formal union. But at the same time, we match them to married heterosexual counterparts of similar age, living in similar municipality, having the same number of children. So I'm very open to suggestions as to which mechanisms I should explore. As you see, I have plenty of observations. So I have plenty of opportunity to see what is at play. All right, just to conclude, my results based on the Swedish population data, where I have individual level turnout data for the entire population for 4 elections and access to the whole population of partnered before 2009 and married after 2009 same-sex couples, shows that there is persistent positive sexuality gap in turnout. This gap is not abating despite the fact that LGBTQI+ rights are not on the agenda to the same extent as they have been in the 1990s and 2000s. Of course, we have a threat from the Sweden Democrats, but Sweden Democrats do not really challenge the right to marriage in a way that their counterparts in other countries do. And this, what I show is that what I provide is then the evidence that the non-straight identity has a stable and strong effect on political participation of those who identify with a non-straight group identity, even in situations when LGBT issues are not on the agenda and there are many political parties. There is high turnout, as I said, in the general elections around 85%. And most political parties in the Swedish parliament are explicitly pro-LGBT rights. Okay, I thank you for your attention and I look forward to your questions.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you, Stuart, and thank you, Mikal. Let me start off the conversation with a couple of questions, and then please send me a chat message if you'd like to ask questions as well. After me, I have Alberto, and then I'll take some other questions too. So let me start with Stuart. I think probably many of us were struck by your comparison with the United States and the United Kingdom, and Pat Egan's work of, nearly a decade ago now. So, I mean, the knee-jerk reaction to that, at least for me, would be that this is just demonstrating that the ability to be out, the ability to self-identify is reaching much closer to the real, if I can say that, population that exists, right? So even in the United States, I mean, the last presidential election, we were finding pretty consistently about 10% of voters in the US identifying as queer in some way, LGBTQ in some way. So, I mean, it seems such an obvious answer that you are finding a social space in the United Kingdom that is allowing people at least to self-identify in surveys as their sexual orientation or gender identity appropriately. And I'm not even sure why you would sort of even try and find other answers to that, other variables, other reasons for why that's not the case. I mean, why don't you just sort of say, and this isn't a challenge or critique, but just say, well, yes, we're just picking up a much more real survey of the identities of the British population.
Yep, thanks. Great question. So I share that interpretation that if you look over the temporal time of the panels, for example, more individuals over time are more likely to identify. So that signals that the social constraints of identification are diminishing. So we're probably getting closer to the population. What I think is interesting, though, is that because more individuals are feeling comfortable to identify, we can be more confident about the fact that non-cis heterosexual identity is having an independent effect on political outcomes, whereas before it was assumed because of these identification problems, or there isn't an effect, or the effect is marginal compared to other things.
Right. Okay. And the other question I had was, you probably don't have the data, unfortunately, to test this, but maybe you can give us your interpretation or your gut feeling, in the sense that you're dealing a lot of political party signaling on these issues, and sort of the attractiveness to left-wing parties is their embrace of LGBT rights, at least LGB rights. But obviously in the United Kingdom, we have a sort of fairly interesting phenomenon. And maybe some people will take issue with this interpretation, but let me sort of say on broad strokes, Thatcher is very homophobic and, you know, transphobic, but that's not really an issue. Cameron is very inclusive and demonstratively homosexual, bisexual, inclusive, and does a number of things under the Conservative Party. And then I think it's reasonable to say that at the very least, Johnson has stepped back from that level of demonstrative inclusion and signaling of the validity of LGBT people, and especially T people. So you almost have a controlled experiment here where the signaling of the Conservative Party has gone from very hostile to pretty inclusive back to partially hostile again. And I'm wondering if there would be some change in the behavior of voters responding to this signaling.
So great question. One paper I have had in my drawer for like maybe 2 years now is a natural experiment with a panel where individuals were interviewed before the Conservatives legalized same-sex marriage, and the same individuals were interviewed after. And I find that they essentially do not move towards the Conservatives. So there was no premium for them leaning into LGBT tolerance. I mean, I don't want to say advocacy because I wouldn't go that far, but I mean, essentially they're leaning into this new electorate, didn't provide them with any net gains. But on Cameron's own admission in some of his biographical work, he did signal that it might have been detrimental to the party in their base. So I guess to draw a parallel with the United States here would be, there's little incentive for the Republicans to become pro-gay, because some of their base will never adopt that agenda, and the individuals who in the electorate who are very pro-gay, to use that term, are never going to be persuaded because of how they vary on other issues, immigration, right, for example.
Right.
Yes, but yes, I should revisit that paper that's sitting in my drawer.
No, the more data you get, and the more Johnson returns into a facsimile of Margaret Thatcher, then it becomes an even better controlled experiment. Not that it's good for real life.
Yeah. As a final point to that question, this is not something I've looked at in great deal, but I have seen in the British election study, there's a question about whether a particular party makes you feel certain emotions. And one of these emotions that they measure is fear. And LGBT individuals are fearful of the Conservative Party when you look at these variables. I mean, I haven't done formal modeling on this, but just looking at the descriptive variables, there's a perception of fear for the party, and that makes me think either voters think they can't be trusted on the specific question, or that the reputational damage caused by Thatcher Section 28 ETC has a long-term trajectory that hasn't yet diminished.
Right. And final question for you, Stuart. Are your results in any way mediated by race? In the sense that does being BME or person of color in the United Kingdom affect your inheritance of family partisanship?
So I actually don't know if it affects how you inherit partisanship. What I do know is that, against my expectation, it doesn't affect your outness in the survey. And my pre-registered hypothesis was that it would, in that non-white individuals might be less willing to because of maybe religious affiliation, not necessarily race, or other social conservatism, but it doesn't. But I don't know off the top of my head if it affects the intergenerational transmission.
Great. Okay, thank you. And then a question for Mikhail. So from what I understand in Sweden, it's quite unique in the, as you said, the pretty consistent across the board commitment by all political parties to at least on paper, the rhetoric of LGBTQ institutional rights. And even the Swedish Democrats, I mean, I have 2 Swedish Democrats as out LGB members, one gay, one bisexual, in the Swedish parliament right now, along with 14 others. And I wonder whether the fact that, when you look at the cohort, when you look at the candidates, and when you look at the partisan manifestos, LGBT people seem to be in the moderates, in the Swedish Democrats, in the Social Democrats, in the Left Party, in the Greens. They're sort of really spread across the board. And in some senses, you might think, well, this takes the impetus out of mobilization, right? Because everybody's on your side. But what do you feel about the interpretation that because there is such a pretty broad alliance coalition for basic rights, it actually just enables and empowers people to be more politically involved anyway? They're sort of removing almost the fear factor about fighting for your rights because everyone is largely on the same page.
Yes, so I think this is an excellent reflection, but my gut feeling on this front would be that once you remove this, once you feel like this is secured, I mean, going back to Stuart's theory of vote if your rights depend on it. Once you accept that my rights don't depend on this, should you not fall back to the same patterns as your comparable heterosexuals, meaning that you might still have higher turnout rate because of your education, but I mean, the difference should become non-significant. And this is not the case. And I find it very, very interesting because my expectation would be that it should level out. I mean, there should still be sort of education based gap and sort of municipality mean participation driven effect, but not this sort of positive and significant gap, even if we include fixed effects for education. So that's very interesting. But when it comes to your observations about Swedish political parties, they are really unique animals in the sense that all of them, except for Sweden Democrats, now have an LGBTQI plus wing, including the Christian Democrats, which have been sort of the last ones before Sweden Democrats to drop their opposition to same-sex marriage. And that makes it very unique because we do know that LGBT individuals are more likely to be left, are more likely to have pro-egalitarian views. But in Sweden, we have all these LGBTQI wings within the conservative parties. And this is sort of an opening, I feel, for a qualitative study of those individuals who are engaged in these wings. I mean, how is one conservative and LGBT? And I think Sweden has perfect data for this, perfect populations of individuals who are engaged in all these parties.
Great. No, that's great. Thank you. Okay, let me call on Alberto to ask a question.
Yes, can you hear me? Perfect. So my question is for Stuart. So I find it very interesting. So both papers are super interesting. Thank you, because I learned a lot from both. but regarding Stuart's paper, I had a question on this on socialization. So I find it very interesting that he points out to this like third type of socialization source, apart from these like heteronormative classic theories of family and rather like structure. But the thing is that the theory it's that well, because you are born LGBTQI, then at some point you will find your community, and then because this community is rather like leftist, maybe this is also in a way like this one of the theories you mentioned, like this could also like make you more leftist. But then I wonder whether this like alternative socialization source that we have as LGBTQI is based on structure, like because being LGBTQI should be associated to the left because they are more supportive of queer rights than your left, or is it because of the community that you were starting to belong to and you're starting to communicate with, they are more leftist, that you just take their values as you would take from your parents. So at the end, it's like you get again like the family versus the structure in the LGBTQI socialization. So it's like it's also like two different paths, and I think this an important differentiation, because depending on which path works, then there will be more feedback effect or less. Because if there's some sort of homo-nationalist entrepreneurial politicians, and now there's like some sort of accepted LGBTQI right-wing groups, then maybe if you are born in a right-wing family, you will go to this type of groups, or you will associate to this type of groups, and then you will develop some sort of it will be more like it will be more legitimate to develop right-wing kind of attitudes, even if you're queer, because these groups exist. On the other hand, if it's more like structural and there's still like some sort of attachment between being queer and being leftist, or in the case of the US, progressive or yeah, from labor, then it is not that much of a feedback effect, and we shouldn't really worry that at some point, because it is more accepted to be LGBTQI and right-wing, this sort of loyalty will, you know, be reduced or shrinked. So the question is, do you think this is a feedback? We're like in a kind of a feedback effect, that because older LGBTQI people are leftists and we're put in this type of communities, then at some point, like people turn into leftists when they're young? Or is it more like, you know, like some sort of link between being left and LGBTQI rights defending this type of rights?
Yeah, so great question. I think that there's like, basically there's a substitute in one type of socialization for another. So like, I think Mikhail used the term re-socialization, which is what I would interpret as taking place. And the fact that the shift takes place amongst the LGBTs that I consider on issue spaces that really have nothing to do with LGBT rights, such as the economy, or such as, you know, tougher penalties on prison sentences and blah, 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 speaks to me that there's more than just spatial alignment. So not just voting for parties who want to advocate your rights, but also for agendas or belief systems that tend to be more liberal. Whether if in a system where a homo-nationalist party emerged could break that up, yeah, I think it's difficult. I think it would be difficult for a queer subculture that was homo-nationalist to gain enough critical mass for it to allow for socialization in that direction, as opposed to the status quo queer culture, which is more liberal. So if, for example, to give the Love Victor example, the teenage boy is like looking for queer individuals in the internet or in some sort of non-local context, the chances are, because of the the consolidation of leftists in the queer community, that the socialization he or she is going to receive is going to be left. Sure, in the future, if there's more of a mass of homo-nationalist queer individuals, socialization could go in the other direction. But my hunch is that at the moment, it's like feedback mechanisms are taking place because they are engaging in a culture that advocates these things. At least feedback if they come from a liberal home, but in the results that I demonstrate, some individuals come from strong conservative homes and are abandoning, to use that term, where they should vote and becoming more liberal. Because I assume, but can't test, they're being re-socialized into a liberal lefty environment. Does that answer the question?
That answers the question, but I have another question, which is quite quick. Can I?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
no, go for it.
So-
Go for it. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I wonder whether like I don't know whether you looked at it or whether there's enough sample to look at it. But I wonder like whether like the non-leftist LGB, because you just have LGB individuals in the sample, are more likely to come from, you know, like conservative families, like to reverse the way to observe it, because it would be interesting, like, okay, like there's like this sort of break, even if you are from the right, you end up like going more leftist because you socialize this other way. But yeah, to look it the other way, like those who stay in the right, are they just like, are they more likely to just come from the right, or there's some, I don't know, just I don't know, that's the question.
Okay, so I'm thinking about, I mean, I don't know the answer, but so I think if I was to do what you're asking empirically, it would be if like what would I model? I would model if people who come from conservative homes are more likely to be, one, heterosexual, and two, vote for conservative parties. Is that correct?
Yes, or you know, like there's still like LGB like non-leftist individuals. Like there's less, but there are some, and then maybe there are like some new like those who are like now sympathizing with some sort of homo-nationalist attitudes. So I wonder whether they are like some like in a way they are not breaking everything with their family, but they're like taking some of the parts, and these are at the end like right-wing people, like or people who are right-wing or coming from a right-wing background, who are like okay, like, you know, like they don't break with everything but only in part. Whether socialization has a role in like in this like maybe new wave of you know, like homo-nationalist voters, and it's not only like an elite entrepreneurial story, but also like some sort of fertile ground for this, you know.
Yeah, so I completely understand. I think I can test this, but essentially it will be looking at, if, to use how it's flippantly called in the UK, gay Tories, if they are coming from consolidated Tory backgrounds, and basically they're resisting the socialization into lefty gay culture. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, I'm confident that I can test this.
Okay, yeah, I mean, it's just curiosity. Of course, it's not the scope of the study, but I was just thinking about it. But yeah.
Yeah, but it's a long road research project, so more questions to ask.
Yeah. You're muted.
You're on mute, Andrew.
I think we can close with Stuart posing a question to Mikal.
I'm on mute there. So yeah, Mikal, I was going to ask one empirical question is, so am I right in thinking that non-partnered individuals are just removed from the study, right? So they're essentially matched on partnership. So that implies that the unmatched are removed. So single individuals would be removed, is that right? And then I had a couple of conjectures about why the gap might still persist. One is just that learned experience doesn't die, in the sense that because you are the product of a movement that had to engage in voting like your rights depended on it, when you get the prize, you still value it a lot. So are aware that democracy is important and can be under threat, or that nothing is taken for granted. I'm thinking about, off the top of my head, an African-American context would be, okay, the civil rights movement established ABC, and the fight for ABC has made me aware that it's so very important to keep that fight going. The second thing I'm thinking of is that, at least some of the things I'm working on now, is that the fear or the desire for rights are not like limited within the state. So the fact that there are struggles for LGBT rights going on in your neighboring states is again another incentive or another trigger that your participation is important, because look at your neighbors who are having this, you know, Poland no gay zone, etc. And that's a mechanism for within your state to participate in the process. I suspect that you can't test these, but this is just post hoc rationalization about your findings.
All right, thanks for these questions. You're right, the sort of in the matching procedure, the non-partnered heterosexuals are removed. That means that the partner, because I only can identify partnered or separated, so formerly partnered LGBs, and those are then matched as non-partner separated LGBs can be matched to separated heterosexuals. But there must be some kind of record of formal partnership to be kept in the matching sample. But when it comes to the fixed effects regressions, those are done on the entire adult population. So there you've seen over 7 million observations, and I have as the main independent variables the LGB identifier, and as a control the being partnered or registered as family and as a different sex family. But that is done on the entire population. When it comes to learned experience, very good point. Again, I mean, when it comes to the research on the Black vote in the US, I mean, there is this identification of a drop after the civic rights movement and a recovery, or even, I mean, a greater peak during Obama era or in the run-up to the Obama era, that would sort of go against the learned experience theory, but perhaps a different period, 1970s, perhaps not that transferable to today, and perhaps a combination of learned experience and some degree of selection. I mean, something about you that makes you enter into this formal partnership. So I mean, this is something that we need to keep in mind. I do have a lot of LGBs, but all these LGBs have entered into a formal partnership. So there might be that to keep in mind. It's not the same to perhaps enter into same-sex marriage as to enter into a different sex marriage. So I mean, there the matching might be, you know, I mean, you do match, but it's still different things that you match on. This fear internationally, I feel like that's something that is very relevant to the European elections, and that's why I was very happy to see. I mean, there's many explanations to why we see a greater spike in the European elections. The first and foremost is the lower turnout, which sort of really increases the incentives for participating. But what is particular for the 2009 election was that the European elite was concerned with the impeding wave of radical and Eurosceptic parties entering the European Parliament. So they ran a lot of non-partisan campaigns in a lot of member states, including Sweden, aimed at increasing participation. So that might have had a profound effect on LGBTs in Sweden, who have just a month ago received the right to marry. The thing is that we have the same effect in the 2019 election, which was not at all characterized by the same fear of sort of Eurosceptic backlash, or at least not to the same extent. I mean, the Eurosceptical forces have sort of taken their whole stronghold in the parliament. It wasn't the same kind of fear that the parliament will be taken over by them. But absolutely, and I think it can be indirectly tested by looking at the European election. But again, the problem is that there are other factors that increase the turn, that sort of have a positive effect on the turnout among minorities in those elections.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. And thank you especially to Mikhail and to Stuart. These were both terrific papers and terrific presentations, and hopefully we'll see them in print and their sequels soon. So I will send out an announcement about the next QPW. Tell your friends that the session is still going. We'll hopefully generate some more people next time. So thank you very much and keep safe, and we'll see you sometime in December. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for inviting me.